Good day, I'm Dr. T and welcome to my office. So in today's video, I would like to talk about actually doing guided inquiry learning and running a classroom, because there's a little bit more to this than just simply having the activity and telling the students to, go do it. So in previous videos, I talked about active learning, how it's a great approach, and the style that I predominantly use is guided inquiry learning. And I'm heavily influenced by the work of the POGIL project. POGIL stands for Process-Oriented Guided Inquiry Learning. And they've got a little bit of a different style than what I use. They focus not just on the inquiry learning, but also on teamwork and collaboration. I don't quite do that much, but it is still a great approach. So if you get the opportunity to go to a few POGIL workshops, I totally recommend doing so. But in the meantime, here's your crash course in how to run guided inquiry learning. And I've got one of my activities. I'm going to be doing this one on Thursday. So if you're one of my Gen Chem students, see you on Thursday. You'll be seeing this up close and personal. Okay, so with doing this, almost always with guided inquiry, in theory it doesn't need to do this, but typically this is done in groups. Group learning definitely does help. And when you're doing this, the idea is you are partially also teaching soft skills. How to work in groups, how to collaborate, and typically one person's going to get it before another, and then them explaining it is going to help out the group. With guided inquiry learning, you do not want groups to get stuck. So you want to hedge your bets so that no one gets stuck. If they get stuck, it's game over until you unstick them. Okay, so with this one, I'm going to assume they're working in groups, and I'm assuming this is not showing up on camera. We'll see how well this does. By the way, this is available on my website, officehourswithdrt.com, I believe it is. I'll link in the description. Okay, so with this one, I tell them, okay, you're working in groups of 3 or 4. Now, students will do what students do, so I won't fight them too awful much, although if they're trying to work solo, I will kind of push back. 2 is a little bit too light, and 5 is a little bit too heavy, but I'd rather 5 than a 2. Okay, so I'll say, okay, you're working in groups of 3 or 4. There are 4 roles. Now, there's a couple different versions of these 4 roles that you'll see floating around. This is the one that I've been using for a few years. So I'll say, okay, one role is the facilitator. The facilitator is basically the boss. They're the manager. And the facilitator will, tell everyone, okay, let's get together. Let's work on this. Hey, you're doing question 1. You're doing question 2. And I'll actually tell the students, hey, it's really good to read the questions aloud. So, pro tip to facilitators, assign a student or one member of your group, maybe do round robin or just have one person do it. Have one person read the questions. Even though I usually give everyone a handout, they tend to whine if I make them share one, although there are distinct advantages to making them share a packet. Then they'll go ahead and they'll read out the first question, and everyone works together on the question. They're going to want to divide and conquer, and that will blow up the system. So they need to go one question at a time, because with guided inquiry, each question builds on the next one. Well, if you try and skip 2 or 3 questions, it's just like skipping steps in a stairwell. You can maybe skip 1. It's going to get really hard if you're trying to skip 2 or 3. So I'll tell the facilitators, okay, your job is to get everything on track, assign maybe someone to read each question, that kind of stuff. The next one is the spokesperson. Let's be honest, they're probably going to be flagging me down for help. So I'll be walking around if I have any TAs, SIs, etc. They're going to be walking around during class, answering questions, unsticking groups. Because remember, with these guys, this is not a test. This is coming up before they've learned the content. So if they get stuck, the whole system falls down. So you want to unstick them if they get stuck on a concept, all the way to just giving them the answers. This is one where the failure is not an option kind of thing. You got to handhold them through if you have to handhold them through, but you don't want to. Well, if the group needs to get my attention, instead of the whole group going, hey, Dr. T, hey, Dr. T, hey, Dr. T, it's one person gets assigned spokesperson. Then that person goes like, hey, Dr. T, here's our problem. And that way it focuses the group, makes them share and communicate what's going on, but it also keeps the chaos down a bit. Additionally, if in the activity, and most of my activities don't do this, but several of the other ones I've seen do, it'll be, okay, so group 3, report to the board what you found for question 6. kind of thing. Put that on the board. Group 4, please put question 7 on the board, something like that. Well, in that case, it's the spokesperson that does that. That way, everyone knows exactly who gets to go up to the board and write their answer on the board, that kind of stuff. The next person is quality control, and that person is basically making sure 2 + 2 = 4 and not 12. They're also kind of the calculator jockey is the idea. They're crunching the number. Some other ones will call that the technician role. And then the last one is the process analyst, and this is the one that gets dropped in groups of 3. The process analyst is helping out the facilitator, and they're trying to facilitate a smooth teamwork, saying, okay, you're talking too much, you're not talking, you need to talk, you need to let other people talk, please. And thus facilitating the discussion, facilitating good teamwork. Keep in mind, when doing a true POGIL activity, there is a lot of emphasis not just on the content being learned, but also the soft skills being learned. Okay, so the students get in their groups, you can assign them. I usually let them self-assign because they're adults. It's not perfect, there's definitely advantages. Some will go as far as to divide the class into quartiles. So the top 25th, the middle bottom, and then the bottom 25th percentile. And each group is assigned from one person from each percentile. They're adults, I'm not gonna do that. But I definitely know that some instructors do that, and there are advantages to doing that. I'm just not going to go through the drama of that. Okay, so once they're in their groups, they're starting on the questions. Now, typically the way I format mine, and you will see them varying depending on the source, is I will typically put the model, which is their source of information, on the back page. So my first direction will be take it apart. So in this particular activity, I have 2 models. Basically some hydrogen atoms and then some lithium and oxygen atoms, and they're drawn out. And the first few questions are going to be the beginning part of that learning cycle where they're exploring the model. And in that beginning part of the learning cycle, I'm actually having them like, okay, question 1, on the model, write how many protons are in each atom. So they're looking at the model and they see the protons are in the middle and the protons are the dark circle, so they're putting them on, etc. So now they're getting a more abstract, easier to work with, but I'm still wanting to focus a little bit more on the concrete. So I am, having a picture of an atom, kind of an anemic Bohr model, if it will. And so now they've got an idea of, okay, how many electrons, how many protons, etc. And what I will also be doing is I'll be walking around looking at their papers. And I'll be looking at see what numbers they have, because I'll know that on a couple of these, it's easy to miss, say, the electrons. So I might be looking, did they write down the right numbers? And if they wrote down the wrong numbers, they're going to be up a creek, so I'll be like, recount those electrons. You missed a few. And so I'm not just waiting for them to answer questions. I'm walking around, I'm listening, seeing what questions they're having. Typically, students will respond to you or ask a question when you walk by much more readily than when you're just in the back waiting for them to raise a hand. It's kind of the doctor's doorknob scenario. Allegedly, and I don't know, I'm not a physician, but physicians will say the patients will bring up the important topic when they touch the doorknob as they're getting ready to leave. So it's like, okay, you should have led with that. Well, students, similar idea. They'll be reluctant to raise their hand, they'll be reluctant to draw you in, but if you're right there, well, I mean, you're just right there. Additionally, I'll be looking at their work, listening to what they're doing, and if they're going off in la-la land, I'll definitely stop, or if they're getting ready to make a very common mistake. Like on my dimensional analysis activity, it's very tempting for them to do cross multiplication, which technically works to start with, but it's not going to go where they want it to go. So they don't really want to be doing cross multiplication. So I'm like, okay, for this, you really don't want to do cross multiplication. Write it in after the cross. So kind of like you would do cross multiplication, but after the cross kind of thing. Anyways, so they're going to go through the learning activity. They've got the beginning stages of the learning cycle. So they're looking at the model, then they're starting to guided towards the pattern. They're prompted to see the patterns in the models and then start drawing conclusions. So this one goes through the learning cycle several times on this one. The first couple of questions are going to be, okay, what do you see the model? Do you see a pattern? Now let's codify that pattern into the form of an equation, help them build an equation, and then Once we have an equation, then we can use that equation to answer other questions about material on here. So partway through, one of the questions is, what do all hydrogens have in common? What do all lithiums have in common? What do all oxygens have in common? Then, what do all chromiums have in common? Notice chrome is not on here. They're going to have to pull open their periodic table in order to get chrome. So yeah, they're drawing conclusions, they're seeing patterns, and then they're using those patterns. And then once it did that for protons, it goes for, what's next? Electrons, I think? Upper right charge, yeah. So next it goes into electrons and then into neutrons, in which case it has a small little activity where it's like, here's a bag of something small. I think they're probably going to get lentils on Thursday. Tell me how many of the little things are in the bag, and the idea is they're learning to count by weight. So, you weigh the lentils, you weigh a lentil, or you weigh a small number of lentils, and then you divide. Which is, of course, kind of the whole concept of a mole is that, but taken out a few more steps. Okay, so that's the basics. I'm walking around, I'm listening to them. Now, as the class proceeds, I want to have a pretty good idea of where everyone's at. The major problem with any active learning activity, and this really goes for guided inquiry learning, is some groups will be faster than others. This is one of the reasons why some instructors really like to try and curate their groups. Once again, I'm not into that drama, I'm not going to, but other instructors really find value in that. But some groups will be faster than other groups. So I'll have some groups completely done, where other groups will barely be crawling through. You don't want to spend an inordinate amount of time, but you want everyone to try and get as far away through as possible. So ideally, everyone completes, but sometimes you're just like, okay, we got to get moving. So you are kind of getting an idea of where is everybody at. Quite often, I'll be asking questions like, okay, is everyone on page 3? Okay. Everyone on page 4? And so on and so forth. Trying to figure out where my groups are. Obviously, the more groups I have, the more play I'm going to have with this. Then typically I'm going to tell them, hey, if you're done early, feel free to take a break, or I'll have some practice problems. And so for these guys, I usually don't grade them. Once they go to the students, they're the students can keep them. But I always do have the threat that if y'all don't give it the old college try, I'm going to grade something. And if I do want to grade something, then what I'll generally do is have a quiz afterwards on the topic. I did this last semester. I'm not doing it this semester. Let's just put it that way. It's not ideal, but it does work, especially if you do need to motivate your students a little bit more. But quite often, I find that's not really a problem. They'll give it the old college try, especially if you made it very clear that these guys are not a test, not a quiz, they're not a grade. It lowers the stress level. Now, your students will vary. I've had students who will just kind of blow it off, won't try. I've also had students that were literally in tears. They're like, this is not a test. You're not expected to know everything on here kind of thing. So with that said, I encourage you to give this a try. The other pro tip that POGIL quite often gives in their workshops is that if you are going to do this, you really want to do at least one of these early in the semester. Ideally, you don't want to drop this in halfway through to the end of the semester because it really changes the tone. This is very different than lecture. That said, I have switched up. I was doing a biochem course, did lecture, we're flying through, and it's like, I need to slow down, and also, we need to go more in depth. And so I used the biochem book through Pacific Crest, which, once again, I actually really like that one. It's a great workbook. The students had mixed opinions, and that is the other thing you will find. Student evaluations when you're doing guided inquiry learning and the like, really all active learning, will typically not be as high as a finely polished lecture. Students don't feel like they're learning as much as when they're hearing it. There's a large expectation gap. So if you start off doing one of these really early, you set the expectations and there's a bit less backlash because you're keeping it nice and smooth. If they're kind of a little more haphazard, it's a little bit more temperamental. But also, a lot of things just depend on your students and what works well with you and how you present them. I definitely found that with one of my classes, I got a lot less pushback, a lot less negative evaluations because of it when I simply stuck these things in the lab manual. And all of a sudden, this was part of the lab. It's a hybrid studio lab type of class. So it's lecture and lab at the same time. You know, turn around, we're going to do this lab kind of class. And that was a very easy option for me. And it was one that was very well received. Okay, so this has probably been one of my more rambling videos. But once again, I do encourage you, give guided inquiry learning a try. I really love this one. If you're at a conference where there are some POGIL workshops, I totally recommend taking advantage of them. So with that said, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you around.